Folks, thanks for coming along tonight on this hot Sydney evening where Patrick Gorman addresses the Sydney Institute for a welcome first time. You're very welcome. So he's well known to many of you, I guess, for standing next to the Prime Minister whenever the Prime Minister's in Perth, in the little line up there. So we know his face, although he hasn't addressed us before. So I'll introduce him briefly as I introduce everybody. The member for Perth since 1918, recontested and won Perth in 2019 and 2022. He's the Assistant Minister, was a former Secretary of the ALP branch in Western Australia, a one-time Principal Advisor to Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, and currently the Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister, a very important role, as well as to the Attorney General and Assistant Minister for the Public Service, and talking tonight on the topic From Servant to Partner, the future of the Australian Public Service. Patrick Gorman, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Gerard, thank you very much for that very kind welcome, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak with you this evening. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge Gerard's leadership of the Institute and acknowledge Anne as well, and thank you very much for having us here. If I can also just extend a little acknowledgement for those who are members of the Order of Australia. One of the joys I have in my responsibilities is to oversee honours policy for the government, and so for anyone who's a member of the Order of Australia, I acknowledge you as well. The future of the Australian Public Service is on the ballot at this election. Tonight, I'll argue to you that all Australians, especially Conservatives, should cherish the public service which we have built together. Peter Dutton has put public service cuts front and centre of the imminent campaign, even today saying that he will use public service cuts to match Labor's promises on Medicare. I'm happy to have the fight about the value of the public service. The values of the public service run deep in my family. My parents were both primary school teachers. My grandmother Pat worked in administration at WA Health at a hospital called Charlie Gardner Hospital. And my great-grandmother Lucy worked as a proud Commonwealth public servant working for the Australian Taxation Office. She worked there after World War II, helping, as many in the tax office do, collect revenue, but also helping war widows like herself get the payments and support that they needed. In 1943, as we were in the middle of that war, John Curtin continues to argue that we needed to win the war and to win the peace. And we did win both, but we began unprepared. As Curtin said in his 1943 election speech, finance on war production while maintaining essential civilian living conditions would have been impossible but for the work of the Department of War Organisation of Industry. This was the department which, under the Menzies and Fadden governments, had been a department with a minister, a typist and a bare room. Now, in 2025, Australia faces the most challenging set of strategic circumstances since World War II. Is it really the time to launch an attack on the public service? At best, deep cuts to the public service will take our nation backwards. At worst, deep cuts will make us less secure, less safe, and unable to shape the world around us. Only the power of our nation combined can ensure Australia is prepared for that challenge. No individual business can, no single citizen can. In other words, there's never been a worse time to cut the public service by 20%. The modern Australian public service is core to John Howard's legacy as Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister. Upon coming to office, Prime Minister Howard did make significant cuts to the public service. However, it's what he did after that which became his most defining legacy when it comes to the APS. As Prime Minister, John Howard introduced the Public Service Act of 1999, the rules of the road for public servants, which still endure to this day. And to quote Mr. Howard, "Let me state at the outset my firm belief that an accountable, non-partisan and professional public service which responds creatively to the changing roles and demands of government is a great national asset. Preserving its value and nurturing its innovation is a priority for this government." I agree wholeheartedly with Mr. Howard. That's why I'm proud that our government has ensured a right-sized public service. The budget papers tell us that the entire public service today is some 209,000 Australians. If it were proportionally the same size as when Mr Howard left office, it would be 226,000 Australians. At the same time, we're delivering on some 2 decades worth of additional responsibilities across the NDIS, AUKUS, the National Anti-Corruption Commission, and the growing demands of the digital economy. And some of our biggest public service agencies are essential for our national security. 19,465 public servants in defence, 15,215 in Home Affairs, and 8,212 Commonwealth employees in the Attorney General's portfolio. Those officials are governed by the same public service values that Mr Howard encoded in law in 1999. Impartial, committed to service, accountable, respectful, ethical. We added one more in 2023. We added the value of stewardship, because we know that it's when we see government officials stray from those values that the service comes into disrepute. The Robo-Debt Royal Commission showed us this writ large. Now for an anecdote at a much smaller level. In 2023, there was an increase in staffing for members of Parliament. Every elected office of every member, regardless of party. I think it tells you something, that not a single member of the coalition claimed that they themselves were so efficient that they did not need that extra resource. They were happy to have more people in their offices. Now, on a more serious note, while I might disagree with the policy conclusions of the coalition, I do value their work. Political parties are an essential part of our democracy. The public service also has a fundamental role in the functioning of a good democracy. Last year, I released the Trust and Satisfaction in Australian Democracy survey. 95% of respondents said that living in a democratic country was important to them. That's a relief. And where there are problems in our democracy, some 85% agree that it's worth trying to fix them. Also encouraging. The survey then looked at trusted sources of information. Friends, family, government, all highly trustworthy sources of information. Then came social media. 1 in 2 Australians outright distrust or strongly distrust what they see on Twitter, TikTok, and the rest. And given that that's where most Australians get their information from, that is deeply concerning. It shows that the challenges for our democratic system are real and that citizens demand factual and impartial information. And therefore, the role of the public service is vital. I have the honour of working with Minister Katie Gallagher on public service reform. And while I'm here defending the service, I also demand a lot more from it. On coming to government, we faced major capability gaps in the public service. 3 years ago, under the coalition, it had become so bad that there were public service agencies contracting out the writing of cabinet submissions. The very core of the Westminster system contracted out to the nearest consultant. It felt like you had some agencies who couldn't even write an email without paying the invoice for a consultant first. So we set upon an ambitious reform agenda. That agenda has seen some $4 billion of savings through reduced labour hire. And central to that reform agenda is a public service that puts people and business back at the centre of policy and services. I talk about going from servant to partner because we know that partnership is where the next big policy breakthroughs are. Partnership is how we make the next steps forward in closing the gap. Partnership with the private sector is how we ensure cybersecurity for all Australians. Partnership is how we deliver the defence industry our nation demands for the decades ahead. And partnership is how we stop the decline in democratic values. This means new expectations on departmental heads and secretaries. We've spent 3 years lifting expectations. We gave the service the resources that they need, but we were also very clear that we expect so much more of public service leaders. It's now an expectation of all APS staff to know how to partner and engage effectively with business. The 23-24 public sector agency survey told us that some 64 agencies had a need for increased engagement and partnership capability over the next 3 to 5 years. Because I fundamentally believe that officials should not develop policy without being properly informed by stakeholders. Our guidance now clearly tells officials they cannot achieve the best outcomes for the country unless they collaborate with business and communities that have shared interests. This is, as we all know, a massive shift in mindset to take the public service back to the public and make sure the impacts on business, especially small business, are thoroughly assessed through robust impact analysis. Our other goal is to be an employer of choice. There is no doubt that the public debate about the public service deters some of our brightest minds from joining the service, and we need to turn that tide. The fundamental rules of the public service have not changed for a quarter of a decade. Well, as I said before, it was John Howard who passed the Public Service Act. It was both Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey served in the role of Minister assisting the Prime Minister for the public service. And when you look closer at the coalition frontbench, you'll also see there's no shame in a career as a public servant. We know, and we all know, that the opposition leader served as a Queensland police officer, but it goes much deeper. Susan Ley, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party, a senior officer at the Australian Taxation Office. Dan Tehan and Dave Sharma, both were career DFAT officials. Anne Ruston was the CEO of a South Australian government-owned entity. Even the comically titled Shadow Assistant Minister for Government Waste Reduction was more than happy to take a well-paid role under the South Australian Public Sector Act of 2009. So coalition members know there is honour in a public service career. We also know the skills needed are changing. Data and digital is one of the core skills of the 21st century. The Australian Public Service Commission advises that some 71% of agencies identify critical digital skills shortages and 70% have data skill shortages. That's not where we need to be in this pivotal decade. So my message to any young Australian who wants to make an impact on this country, our country, is simple. We need your talents to protect the Australia we know today and to build the Australia we want for the future. Because Australia's public service is only as good as the best of our people. And that's why tonight there's one partner I want to call on to do more. The Commonwealth Government is a significant employer of degree qualified graduates. Some 53,378 as at the end of the last financial year. But too often university graduates are not well prepared for the demands of the modern public service. That's unfair on graduates and it's unfair on taxpayers. Every graduate who applies for a role with the Australian government should have excellent written skills and they should have the ability to work across the Australian policy cycle. The Australian Universities Accord Review told us of the problem. Quote, graduates need the transferable generic skills sought by employers. Australian workers now need to be digitally literate, creative, collaborative, good communicators and able to solve complex problems. Our tertiary education providers must teach these skills more effectively. I agree. Vice-Chancellors need to ensure they are meeting the needs of the public service now and the demands of the future. They owe it to their students and they owe it to the nation. In the past, it wasn't partisan to be a supporter of the public service. It was patriotic. It was widely acknowledged that the Parliament, not the government of the day, was the largest driver of the size of the public service. The best contemporary example of this is in Veterans Affairs. The Albanese government did put more staff into the Department of Veterans Affairs because we had 41,000 compensation claims unallocated, not even assigned to an officer for review. The Parliament had passed laws to guarantee support for veterans, but there weren't enough people to enact the laws. Veterans were going without some $6.5 billion of healthcare and financial support our nation had promised them. Those backlogs are now cleared. And across social services, Medicare, Defence, Attorney General's Department and more, the bulk of the public servants that we have today are there to implement the laws the Australian Parliament passes. That's why when you hear people like David Littleproud, leader of the National Party, say, quote, "The first thing we'll do is sack those 36,000 public servants in Canberra," I get a little concerned. Wielding the knife on the public service is rarely a good start for any government. John Howard, Tony Abbott, Campbell Newman can all tell you that. And while it's many decades now since my great-grandmother worked at the tax office on St George's Terrace in Perth, helping deliver war widow pensions, it still sends the wrong message to those who serve Australia in uniform if there's no one there for them after their service has concluded, let alone the politics of the decision. On the ABC's Insiders just over a week ago, we saw JWS research outlining that the only policy less popular than public service cuts was Mr Dutton's tax break for business lunches. That's enough on the immediate electoral horizon. Talk for a moment about the longer term challenges on the economic horizon. One of my responsibilities is to assist the Prime Minister with our legislative program and help oversee the Office of Parliamentary Counsel. In other words, ensuring government prepares for and drafts the laws we need in a timely manner for the challenges we face. At a fundamental level of drafting our laws, the challenges of the decade ahead are much more complex than those that have been. The Treasurer, when launching the latest intergenerational report, told us what would transform our economy in the decades ahead. From hydrocarbons to renewables, from IT to AI, from a younger population to an older one, which changes the industrial base and places a bigger emphasis on the care economy, and from globalisation to fragmentation. Anyone putting themselves forward at the coming election will have to legislate to prepare Australia for those challenges. It will present complex challenges for independents and the Senate, as we need to move faster, not slower, in the face of these challenges. Managed well, we maintain and grow Australia's position as one of the wealthiest and most successful multicultural countries anywhere on earth at any time in human history. Managed poorly, and it will only compound the other challenges on our doorstep. A seismic transformation is happening in our region. We are entering an era of great power contest. The outcome of that contest is not guaranteed. As Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles said here at the Sydney Institute less than a year ago, quote, "A passive assumption that this is how things have always been done was a recipe for continued failure." The Deputy Prime Minister is correct. That's why public service reform is so important. Rolling out reform is hard, and rolling out redundancies is easy. But at this election, Labor puts ourselves forward as the only party who can ensure Australians have the public service and services they expect. That they'll be able to easily apply for a pension. That if they serve in our armed forces, their veterans' claims will be processed with speed. And that somewhere, the brightest minds in Australia are working to ensure a peaceful and prosperous region for us all. There has never been a worse time in Australia's post-war history to be launching a civil war on the Australian public service. Thank you.
I worked 4 years in the Commonwealth Public Service, and I understand the difference between the people on the front line and people behind the line, but I note that in Victoria, the Labor government there is talking about reduction of 3,000 Victorian public servants. But on another point, when you mentioned the Department of Defence, there is a test going around now which would have been a challenge when I worked in the Department of Employment and Industrial Relations, which is, can you explain at the end of the week what you did since Monday? In some of these bigger departments, that's a bit of a test, isn't it? It certainly would have been for me, but there you go. So, how efficient is the Victorian public service if Premier Allen's got to get rid of 3,000 of them?
Well, you'd expect me to be a defender of the Commonwealth Public Service and say that I want it to be the most efficient of any public service in the nation. I understand that the Victorian government is going through a review at the moment. I don't think they've concluded the outcomes of that review, so I definitely won't make the dangerous decision to announce policy outcomes for other levels of government. On the question of what did you do during the week, I think also, and give us your 5 things or give us your bullet points. you use a range of different ways of measuring people's performance in any modern organisation. I don't know that many businesses in Australia who kind of manage it in that sort of a way. I don't think it's the sort of thing that we need to outline. I actually trust the leaders in the public service to make sure we're getting value for money. It's an expectation on them. I have seen reports that obviously some of those requirements that have been put in the United States have put difficulty for some people who work in our security and intelligence agencies. But I think we've got good structures to make sure we get value for money out of people. I mean, I spend a lot of time going around visiting Services Australia. If you're a frontline worker at Services Australia and you're not, answering calls quick enough, responding to customers fast enough, it's all tracked. It's already there. We know. And we know if someone needs an intervention, we know who those people are that aren't delivering value for money. So I don't think we need to have another level of bureaucracy added, because that's ultimately what it would be.
Just down the back.
Minister, could you enlighten us? Is your government's plan to establish a national health scheme with all general practitioners as public servants?
That's not the approach we've taken, and it's not been the path that Australia has gone down. Obviously, as the Commonwealth, we fund state health systems, and often people who work in state health systems, including at Royal Perth Hospital in my electorate, are indeed public servants under state acts. But other parts of health administrations choose to do public-private partnerships. There's one of those that services my electorate as well, Midland Hospital. So there's different ways of how you deliver health services through the hospital system. It's definitely not our intention when it comes to our major commitment for Medicare. It's about trying to support general practitioners who've gone out, started both, a business where they can make a good living, but also make a real difference for their communities. And what they're seeing is they're being torn between those two objectives. So by putting more money into Medicare so that more people under our plan, 9 out of 10 Australians will be able to see a bulk billing doctor by 2030, we think that that's going to make sure that you actually have the health care we need, and also it's a major investment in primary care. We know that that's one area where you get very strong returns out of investing in primary care. And also we've done this, we've listened to what the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners have told us. We've listened to what health consumers have told us, and we see that this is the way forward. But to make sure that you have a properly funded Medicare system, but still where the doctors are, running their own practices, running their own businesses. Even when it comes to our Medicare urgent care clinics, which we've rolled out some 87 of across the country. They are run by organisations, some not-for-profits, some for-profit providers, but they're run by organisations who can actually run an efficient health service at the best possible price for the Commonwealth. So no, I don't think there's any intention there, and I'd be very concerned if anyone is suggesting that that's our plan, or indeed if someone was suggesting that as their own plan.
Thank you, Minister. While we're talking about efficiency, post-COVID, what's the working from home component for federal public servants? And now that the world is moving back to getting everyone together to improve productivity, what are your plans to require people to attend at work?
If you're working from the really simple way, if you're working from home in the Commonwealth Public Service, there has to be a public benefit to that. That's how I describe it when I get asked by public servants. And there are benefits of allowing people the opportunity to have more flexible working arrangements. Also, as I said, we want to be an employer of choice. We're out there competing in the market for talent, and so we need to make sure that people come into the public service. The vast majority of public servants do their work in a Commonwealth workplace. We've got some 583 Commonwealth workplaces across Australia. Many of them are Services Australia and Medicare service centres and those sort of things. But we have a large number of workplaces One thing that you have seen a bit of a shift in, though, that has helped us in terms of the recruitment and retention of talent, which is one of the biggest challenges for any major employer, is that people can do work from a public service location other than just based in Canberra. And that has given us real benefits. People being able to go into another office or a branch of, say, Services Australia and do a leadership role from a different location.
Just while you're on that topic, I've got a note that I'll take before the next question that comes in on one of our Zoom listers, which says, can you explain the absence of cars in the Treasury car park as photographed in the Australian Financial Review a couple of months ago? There weren't any there. And could this have anything to do with the budget blowout, I think?
I'm not familiar with the photo. I am familiar with Canberra's growing and impressive public transport network. Maybe there's a few of them who are now catching the Canberra light rail and then walking across the bridge. I know that they've broken the ground on the next step of the light rail that will bring it over into the parliamentary triangle. I'll actually say, my experience, obviously the Public Service Commission is in the same precinct as Treasury. My experience is somewhat the opposite, which is I quite enjoy going for a walk on an evening of a sitting week. If I'm lucky, I'll get out of the building about 8 or 8:30 at night. I normally go and do the parliamentary triangle, which is about a 5K round trip, and I'm always impressed to see lights on, particularly in the Treasury Department. And I think anyone who's gone through a budget cycle or two knows that taxpayers get pretty good value for money out of hard-working Treasury officials, particularly as we get close to budget.
But they could leave the lights on without being there,
Look, I don't think the climate conscious citizens of Canberra would dare do that.
We've got plenty of time, folks. There's a question down there.
Good day, Minister. My name's James. Just a question, I guess, on the popular perception of public servants. I suppose, in conversations in the media, conversations like this, it can be easy for public servants to be perceived as, effectively as a faceless bureaucracy. But by the nature of the work a lot of these public servants do, they're not exactly able to be out there talking about the work they're doing. So potentially a hard question, but what is the fix to that? How does one sort of, communicate the work of that public service when often they can't do it themselves?
That's an excellent question. I think if we let's all do a collective reset of our minds, the picture in our mind of who is the typical public servant. The typical public servant is a woman in her 40s working at Services Australia, and on very modest incomes, helping people get things like pensions and family assistance payments. Pretty basic work, but pretty essential work. In terms of changing perceptions, what I always say is that you can think of public servants as sort of a way and an other, but I also always point out public servants are our family, our friends, and our neighbours. Like, everyone knows someone who's had a career in the public service. And most of those people went and worked in the public service for good reasons, because they thought it was a way to make a contribution. Whether that be, the people I deal with at the Australian Financial Security Authority, AFSA, they help people in the toughest of times when they're going through bankruptcy. They're for those people to help them get a fresh start. Through to people who might come and work in a policy area such as Treasury, because they think they can actually make a contribution to the thinking of the nation. But again, most public servants, the average public servant, a woman in her 40s, working at Services Australia, helping people get family assistance payments. And wherever you look, you sort of find that actually there's so much more good in what people do. And most people, whatever you do in life, no, again, it's one of those truisms. No one goes to work wanting to work in a fake job, and no one goes to work wanting to do a bad job. Pretty much everyone turns up wanting to make a contribution. And that's what I see every day. Yes, public servants can't speak in the same way that those of us in civil society have the freedom to. And there's a good reason for that, because I also don't want to see a politicised public service. I don't want to see public servants come out and start to have to advocate for themselves or engage in more contentious policy debates. You need that apolitical, ethical public service. And so that comes with some restrictions on what public servants can do in the public domain.
Thank you very much. In America at the moment, public servants would appear to be sort of being fired willy-nilly. What processes would you have to go through here if, in fact, you decided, all right, well, the first thing we're going to do is get 40,000 people or whatever the number is out? I mean, can we rely on the fact that I think probably a couple of months ago people didn't think this was going to happen in the United States, and maybe in the end it won't be able to happen, if you see what I mean. But I'm just wondering what process these people are thinking of.
Process.
So if the 36,000 public servants is the figure that the Coalition have said that they want to reduce the public service by. They've said, the Leader of the Opposition's repeated that today, so we'll take that as the real, on-the-table suggestion. Yes, it can be done. It can be done quite easily. There are not huge legislative roadblocks. You would simply reduce the funding for agencies and require them to accommodate or to reduce their headcount to that extent. If you take it, that 36,000 as a across-the-board reduction, it's about 20% per agency. So I work on the assumption that you would do it as an across-the-board 20% efficiency dividend to every agency. They all drop by 20%. That would be the neatest, most straightforward way to do it. It would be done as part of the budget process.
Over what period of time?
I imagine it would be, again, I can only go on what the Coalition have said they intend to do, which is that they would do it as their first item of business. That's what the aspirant to be Deputy Prime Minister, David Littleproud, has said. So I would imagine that would be done in the first year, in the first budget. Would they have to wait for a budget? No, they could commence doing that sooner. We've seen in the past hiring freezes implemented by coalition governments where it's done as an attrition basis rather than simply done on a headcount basis. But if you want to get a 36,000 public servant reduction, it's going to be ugly.
Thanks for your talk, Patrick. Apart from the fact that debt is skyrocketing and government spending needs to be brought under control all over the Western world, and therefore public servants and whatever get fingered. But to me it seems, and I'm going off a very good piece by Colin Lilly in The Australian on the weekend about arts funding and how so much of it goes washing through endless bureaucracies and artists get very little of it. And it seems to me over a long period of time we hear X number of $1 billion here and X number of $1 million there, but nobody ever gets told where it went, how it was spent. Yeah. And there's been an incredibly over-bureaucratising both in big private industry and the public service over the last several decades. So that people, if you ask a teacher what they did for the last 5 days, they'll tell you. A nurse, they'll tell you. A policeman, they'll tell you. But if you ask the average officer in an endless bureaucracy what they did, and they did tell you, you'd say, well, what was the end product of this? And you would probably decide there wasn't any end product, that there were a lot of meetings, a lot of discussion, a lot of charts drawn up, and it goes round and round. And my experience of the public service, and I've been with the archives here in New South Wales, is that the trouble with the public service is that no one is responsible for an outcome. Everyone is just a link in a chain. And to some extent we've seen this in the ABC, in the courts over the decision to sack the young journalist. Can you comment on how we can make the public service less bureaucratised in a sense and more about outcomes?
Yeah. I think one of the things I really want to see is to see a public service where people can come in and out of the public service more, so they can bring some of those fresh ways of doing things, fresh thinking, and make sure that you do have the best modern management practices in the public service. I think I'm a huge supporter of the arts, and I want to see good funding for the arts, and I want to make sure that money gets to artists who produce things for audiences and that people can enjoy art wherever they live in Australia. And I think we actually do have, I think some of those reflections have been true in the past, but I think we've now got very good tracking of where funding goes. I'm actually going to call out my friend and acknowledge him with his former role. Stepan Kirkashian is the Deputy Chair of the National Australia Day Council. The reason I raise that is because one of the things I oversee the National Australia Day Council, and one of the things that Stepan has to do is help us pump out about $5 million of Australia Day grants for Australia Day, only for Australia Day, every year. And we've got to make sure that, with some 750 events around the country, we're getting good value for money for all of them. I then have to table that list in Parliament, be clear about which councils got the money. They all have to provide a report back to us. And while some people might say, well, it's a lot of paper moving around, I also think that I have to do that and have to have that expectation, because if people can't see where the money's going, I won't get it next time. Or you won't trust those organisations to deliver for you in the future. So we do have to have those accountability mechanisms. I think there's been a good piece of work across I talked about the data skills shortages that we do have. I've been really open about that. That's one of the biggest skills shortages. But what you've seen is a big shift towards more data being published by agencies. So a lot of those things that might have been previously published as just a PDF somewhere on a website now gets published in its raw data form, so people can do much more complex analysis. I always encourage people who have sometimes better skills in artificial intelligence or more freedom than what exists in the public service to do those deep dive analysis of where Commonwealth money is going. I think that's a good thing. I'm pretty relaxed about it. But it's an ongoing journey. We've got to do more and more of that work.
We'll go down the back and then down here.
Thanks, Minister. We have a federal government, we have state governments, we have more local councils than you can poke a stick at. We are the most overgoverned nation on the planet. Have you ever given any thought how we could reduce the bureaucratic footprint on this great nation?
Have I given it thought? Yes, I have. Will I share all of those thoughts? No, I won't. I think that's probably the most honest and straightforward way to answer your question. I come from Western Australia. You talk about lots of local governments. There's about 538 local governments across Australia. 25% of those local governments are in the West. We have lots of small councils. I think about that in the context of my role as the federal member for Perth. I cover 5 different local governments in my singular federal electorate. I look at my friends at the other end of the scale from within the city of Brisbane, where I think you've got about 7 or 8 federal members for one council. But ultimately, these are democratic decisions of people. And if I'm going to stand here and talk about the values of democracy and stand here and talk about accepting that you need to respect and cherish democracy and empower it, then I have to accept that the only way you're going to see particularly local governments come together is through people in those local governments choosing it for themselves. And there is merit in doing that, and there are examples where that has happened and it's been a real success. I don't think you're going to see any time in, we've had 124 years of federation. I don't think in the next 124, I don't think you're going to see much change to the structure of the states. I think that's just the system we've got. And so I always believe put your energy into making things that you've got work rather than trying to change things that you're just never going to get done.
Mr. Gorman, thank you. Overall, between the public service and private enterprise, there are probably an equal number, approximately equal number of people who are highly competent, people who are average, and people who are duds. So how is it that the Australian public service enjoys such better superannuation than the private enterprise? And how is it that people in the Australian public service can't just be sacked if they don't come up to expectations?
Well, let me add one more to the list. Public service, private enterprise, let's add Parliament as well, because there's a few duds in there as well. I'll leave you all to come to your own conclusions of who. Firstly, public servants can and are sacked. That data is available in the State of the Service report. That does happen. And it's done for performance, it's done for ethical reasons, it's done where people might have breached some part of the Public Service Act. So we do sack public servants where it's necessary to do so. It's a fundamental management tool that any self-respecting employer needs to have. It's not where you always, not ever at the point that you want to get to, but that's provided for in the Act, in John Howard's Act. When it comes to superannuation, I'd sort of note that the historical differential comes about because we got rid of what were quite overly generous pension schemes that sat in the public service in decades gone past. Now, public servants just get a contribution to their superannuation. Historically, wages in the public sector have been a little bit lower, particularly for those who are, the bulk of the public service, those, that average woman in her 40s working at Services Australia, and they get paid, maybe if you work for Services Australia, you might be getting $75,000 a year. A good, respectful wage, but nothing that's going to leave you as a multi-millionaire at the end of your working life. And so we've had that additional bit of superannuation when we took away the much more generous pension schemes. I note now that the differential is, that any Australian worker receiving a wage, superannuation is now 12%. So the gap is much smaller than it has been in the past, and it's part of the remuneration package that we offer, often with sometimes a lower base wage.
Minister, a big question. Can you contrast the public service with the ABC television series Utopia?
A huge fan. I think anyone who's watched Utopia would say, whatever you've worked in life, would say, I've been in a meeting like that. I've been in a meeting where I'm not sure that anything's going to happen as a result of the meeting. I'm not sure why we had the meeting. And I'm not sure if the people who are talking to each other understood one another. I've actually had the experience though. Gerard mentioned I worked for Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. So I've had the experience of 2013, working with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. I think that was around the same time that Utopia started to come onto our screens. And re-entered in 2022, the Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister, dealing with the same department. And I was thoroughly impressed with the increased capability and focus on outcomes. There'd been a real transformation journey, and I want to give a bit of credit to former Prime Minister Turnbull. He had made some serious investments in the public service when it came to ICT. When it came to information communication technologies, to make sure that people could work much more efficiently, could get much more done. And obviously, he didn't know it was around the corner, but that made a huge difference during the pandemic, where you did have to have, it was Prime Minister and Cabinet who helped Prime Minister Morrison coordinate National Cabinet, which actually was, government at the absolute opposite end of Utopia. It was government moving so quickly that you were implementing decisions made in the morning being implemented that night. But it's a great series. Rob Stitch is an incredible Australian talent, and I guess you can always learn things from comedy. I'll leave it at that.
I just had a quick Zoom come in from someone in Richmond, Tasmania, who's watching this. Says, good idea about Utopia, but has Utopia ever thought of doing a Utopia job on the ABC? She makes the point that it took 6 steps to dismiss a journalist who'd worked for 3 days instead of 5 days, and it took 6 steps through the bureaucracy. And it goes on to say, might it be possible for the ABC to do one on themselves, like the BBC did one on themselves? I forget its name. The BBC one, I forget. What was it called? Okay, yep.
I won't comment on a case that's before the courts. I still want to have my job by the time I walk out that door. Secondly, the ABC does have editorial independence, so if they choose to commission that is a matter for their directors and their board. When it comes to my earlier point, which is you can learn a bit from humour. And I think anyone who can't at some point take the piss out of themselves kind of is looking at things wrong. I don't mind taking the piss out of myself. I think it's a pretty Australian value. But how the ABC chooses to take the piss out of itself, I will leave to them.
I'll be quick. Thank you for talking about the three levels of government. One thing that you didn't talk about was the overlap in certain areas. For example, health, education and planning approvals, where you've got multiple layers dealing with the same issue. And are there any plans by your side of government to reform that, to reduce that amount of overlap? You said you came from Western Australia. I noticed that Western Australia was particularly vociferous about certain overlaps in the planning area for mining.
I don't think you'll ever see a level of government, say, where there are serious concurrent responsibilities, walk away from that. You talk about the example of education. Obviously, Minister Jason Clares just is in the process of negotiating new education funding agreements with the states. Of course, the Commonwealth has an interest in how primary and secondary education is run, and we've put in those agreements expectations around more when it comes to numeracy and literacy and teacher standards. Of course, we have an interest in that because we then pick up the bill when they go to university. So the last thing you want is to sort of go, oh, we don't care about them for the first 18 years. They arrive at university and we go, who on earth educated this person? So of course the Commonwealth is going to keep an interest in primary and secondary education. Similarly in health, the reason that the Commonwealth contributes is we have a much greater ability to raise revenue. Health is always one of the biggest pieces of a state budget. We need to have a bit of Commonwealth money in there as well. That's why we have the agreements. We extended them out for an additional year just a few weeks ago to make sure that we're investing in what people expect. But we'll also take responsibility for our part, which is primary healthcare. And so those dividing lines are there. I actually think the bit that we all need to think about a bit more is where is there going to be big change that really neither Commonwealth or state is doing the whole job. I talked before about what Treasurer Chalmers has said around the transformation from IT to AI. AI is going to transform the public service. It's going to transform our society. It's going to transform how we communicate with one another. I talk about when ChatGPT came on the scene, I was like, I don't think that my constituents have all of a sudden become more articulate and more American, but a number of their letters and emails started to become more articulate and more American. And that's because people now are using this in everyday interactions with government. You now see reports submitted to Senate inquiries where you're looking through it and you're like, this wasn't written by a human, and it definitely wasn't written by an Australian. So you're starting to see all of that. And government regulation of artificial intelligence and what it means across education, let's take that example that you raised, what it means there is really important because we might have states starting to regulate what can and can't be done in the classroom. The Commonwealth has an interest in that. So that's the sort of area where we have to start thinking about, how does our federation work with these new and emerging challenges? Similarly, I think that transformation to an older society that we are living through and the intergenerational report tells us is going to be one of the dominant economic forces that we have to legislate for. How states and the Commonwealth deal with that. Similarly, how local government deals with it. Local government are often a really large provider of services in our communities. Are we going to need to see local governments shift where their spending priorities are as we get to an older population that's living longer and living more actively? So there's a lot of those questions. I am, however, a believer in competitive federalism. I think the idea that you have different states trying to do better than one another does give us better outcomes. It does mean that then you've got more ideas and contest to the Commonwealth of different ways of doing things. And that, again, I think helps get us better value for money.
On a quick question and answer. Assume the Albanese government wins, assume you're in the same position. I'm not saying either assumption's correct, but let's assume if you're coming back in, I mean, you may well get promoted, I think, so that's what I'm having to go at there. So if you would come back in, say, 2 years and in the same sort of area, what would you think you might have achieved in a couple of years' time, or do you think most of those reforms you're talking about have been achieved?
No, I would say that I hope all of those things are true, even though I think I've now ventured into the entertaining a hypothetical, which we're not allowed to do. If I came back here in 2 years' time and we're talking about the public service and we're talking about what has changed, I would hope that people would say, all that stuff you talked about the public service, being more serious about partnership and more serious about welcoming people in and having conversations. I didn't believe you at the time, but you were right. And I've seen it. And I've got an example in my community or in my business where actually people started to pick up the phone, listen, and I saw change. That's what I would hope to see. I'd also hope that we've made some serious headway on that big skills gap we have on data. That's the skill that we need to get into the public service. If we're going to we've got some excellent people doing it, we just need more of them. But if we get those skills in, we'll also be able to deal with those big challenges on the horizon.
So there are a lot of people here tonight. It's a hot night, so I'll be very quick. Many thanks to Patrick Gorman for a fine presentation and taking over half an hour questions and answering every one of them across a wide range of issues. So it was a great performance tonight. We'd love to have you back in the future, but for now, well done. Thank you.